Hey everyone, I am Evan Stinson. I'm going to be your host today, talking about all things wildfire risk mitigation. And today we really brought in the expert. We have ISA board certified master arborist, which is incredibly impressive. Robert Warwick. Yeah, Robert was also the former senior vegetation program manager over at PG&E, so he's seen his fair share of wildfires. Robert, I appreciate you joining me for this conversation.
Yeah, thanks so much. Glad to be here.
Awesome. So we're gonna jump into some like tactical and strategic things, but I think first let's just get the overview for wildfires today. What does the state of
Yeah.
wildfires look like today?
Yeah, absolutely. I think saying that wildfires are a rising threat in California, the West Coast, and around the world is probably something that wouldn't surprise a lot of people. Some of the numbers are just incredibly fascinating. Looking at the length of fire season having increased by more than 80 days, going from 4 months to 6 months, that's almost a 50% increase in the number of risky fire days. And I think along with kind of hurricanes and hurricane season is that we're seeing a lot more wildfires occurring outside of fire season. And so there are isolated events, red flag warning days, low humidity days, depending on weather, particularly in California and the West Coast, where it's not necessarily in a fire season, but the conditions are that you would see, something that you'd see in a fire season. And so it might not fit into that 6 month period. In California, a lot of times fire season is treated as a 365-day a year thing. And that brings all kinds of problems and needs, right? Longer fire seasons and more intense fires, larger burn areas, more homes impacted, more lives lost. It really builds from there. I think it's definitely a growing problem, and looking at climate change, it's something that will continue to get worse. I don't think I've seen any studies that say that climate change is getting better or that the wildfire risk is going down.
Yeah, and you mentioned climate change. I think most people agree that climate change is happening. It's a huge impact on everyday life, but I think a lot of people don't realize the effect that it's having on utilities specifically, just that the ability to deliver safe and reliable power to people. Can you talk a little bit about just the impact climate change is having on utilities, and then specifically when it comes to wildfire risk? Because obviously with more droughts and less rainfall, there's just so many issues that kind of compound with that.
Yeah, I think the intersectionality of it is pretty fascinating. We could sit and talk for an hour or more hours, depending on how much coffee we have. But just from a climate change perspective, I think some of the statistics are really powerful. Since 2002 in California, 1 out of every 8 acres in the state has been burned by a wildfire. And I think that's just an incredible number, and one of the largest states in the country, in the world's fifth largest economy. I think if you had looked at Australia or England or Germany and said 1 out of every 8 acres in Australia or Germany have burned because of wildfire, I think that would probably spark a lot of questions as far as what's going on, how are we mitigating it, and what do we do? In 2020, California had its fifth driest water year. 2021 was the second. I live in California, and this year's is going along the same way. It rained a lot in December of 2021, which helped it not be the driest year ever. And it really stopped a lot of our winter weather in January and February. So zero rain January, barely any rain February, when those are usually our wettest months of the year in Northern California. And what impact does that have on utilities? It's increasing fire season. It's making, like we talked about, fires happen outside of fire season. It really creates the need for more predictive and more proactive planning by utilities, because playing catch up and trying to cut trees down as they're dying or mitigate risk as it's found just isn't working. And so there's a lot of things in terms of grid hardening and equipment protections and PSPSs, which we don't want to have anymore, which are being mitigated in terms of shutting power off on smaller segments. But a lot of it is reacting to climate change, reacting to the climate change of today. And if fires are 25 or 50% worse in 10 or 15 or 20 years than they are today, what is the plan of action? So I think understanding what's going on in climate change and then being able to predict and be proactive, I think, is really the biggest focus. And trying to reduce this wildfire risk is a huge focus that there are many intelligent people working on a daily basis. Improving design standards on equipment, developing spark prevention technology, asset management, I think has been a really big change. And vegetation management is one piece of that. And so I think the future is really going to be data driven. And so understanding risk profiles in terms of wildfire, storms, floods, that kind of stuff, in terms of asset hardening, in terms of vegetation, including vegetation health, things like that. So having all of that data will be able to help utility make the right changes in order to reduce risk as much as possible. Budget's always a factor, so not everything can be done right away. So you've got to really be able to understand today's risk, future risk, and then be able to work on that.
1 in 8 acres being burned in Cal, that's a pretty alarming stat. And then couple that with a 2-month more dry season, coupling that with like cost pressures. Obviously, inflation's a huge issue, talent walking out the door. Like you can really see this is getting out of hand quickly. And yeah, I think you're right. You have to have that data and use those tools at your disposal. Otherwise, you're always going to be playing catch up, which is just a losing battle.
It's something, I guess, to think about that's been in the last 20 years. And 20 years is probably right when you start to see a lot of that good growth coming back and that reforestation. It takes a while for the forest to come back the way it was. And so a fire footprint from 20 years ago does not look the same as an unburned area. And so as more fires continue to happen, not just in California, but Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Colorado, New Mexico, it's all over the West Coast. Everywhere we're seeing droughts. Texas is suffering a bad drought. I grew up in Texas and remember the wildfires that happened when there was droughts. And so all of these things are affecting utilities by making it more dangerous, making fires burn hotter, burn longer, affect more assets, which affects lives, reliability. There's just so much to it. And I think having a data-driven approach to where and how to mitigate risk, I think is really going to be the key to the future.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. And let's take a little bit of a detour and talk about what you experienced at PG&E. Obviously, PG&E being such a massive territory out west, you've seen your fair share of wildfire problems. Let's go into that. What problems did you experience? What lessons did you learn? Just kind of walk me through your time there.
Sure, absolutely. I think some of the most interesting lessons learned occurred on fire footprints. I got into the campfire 3 days after it started, and I was in Paradise while the fire was still burning. And we were in there doing inspections, trying to look at vegetation that needs to be assessed and either removed or trimmed or something for power lines to get put back up. So right there in the triage of it all. And there's so many people trying to do good with so much uncertainty. And so what really struck me in the last few years of change at PG&E, I think, is really being focused on data and the impacts of wildfires and really how to make that change. And it's a big ship, so it takes time to move all that. But specifically, things that we would face were just wildfires starting in areas where they wouldn't traditionally start. There are some areas on the north coast of California, north of the Bay Area, that have just some of the most incredible redwood forests that are almost their own rainforests, right? They are so dense and thick that they will actually release enough water vapor into the atmosphere to basically form their own clouds, which then causes it to rain. And some of these just incredible little microclimates that you find in California that unfortunately burned in ways that it may never come back the same way, or it may be 50 or 100 years. And a lot of the redwoods are in fire prevalent areas for a reason, and they do well for fires, but we're seeing fires burning hotter. And so trees that normally would be able to survive something with 75% canopy burn or things like that are actually not surviving as much because of climate change. So there's been just a lot of change in that. Red flag warning days are something that you're seeing a lot more of. Like in 2021, I think it was like a 500% increase in number of acres burned on red flag warning days. So I think that's we've been talking about this kind of outside of fire season fires. And so outside of these normal conditions, which we would expect there to not be as much risk, that risk is still existing. So having to change that mindset, I think that kind of culture change is really the hardest thing, of getting everybody to realize that fire season is 365. It's not just 180 days a year. And then dealing with budget constraints is always something at any kind of utility, right? So seeing the budget just balloon to try to take care of wildfire mitigation, to try to cut the right trees, to try to increase asset hardening, to try to replace poles and upgrade technology and pole clearing. And there's just so much that's being done. I think eventually what happens is the budget becomes a constraint that has to be dealt with. And dealing with that was always a part of it. And so going forward is really trying to figure out how to mitigate the risk with the money that we have now. And then I guess some of the things I really learned was that change is difficult. At the country's largest utility, there are still tree crews and field inspectors using paper maps. There are still kind of technology from 20 years ago that's being used to maintain some of the most dangerous conductor lines in the world. And so I think being able to move to a technology-based approach, not just in vegetation management, but in system hardening and across huge publicly traded utility, is really what I think the most difficult thing is, right? So that change management and getting everybody to buy in and getting everybody to be part of the technology. And so what I took away from that is getting people who are actually working in the trenches, the right tools to do the job, right? So the right technology, easy to use technology, something that makes sense. In addition, clear and concise expectations to do the job, and then really let them go. I never met anybody that wasn't working their hardest to try to get this problem under control. Most people that work for PG&E live in the area that they work in. Their family, their friends, their homes are all in these service territories. And utility people might get a bad rap, but linemen and veg management workers and utility workers, they really do work hard and they really do want to do well. Getting the right people, the right technology, and that kind of stuff, I think, is some of the problems.
Like you mentioned, it's a whole new level of skin in the game when you're talking about someone working at a utility, but you're trying to mitigate fire risk in your own community. Right. If the power goes out, that's one thing, but we're talking about lives and people's livelihoods that can be seriously impacted by this, which is just crazy to think about from someone outside of the utility industry, being like, how do you mitigate this risk when it's your own family that you're mitigating it for? It's just an interesting perspective. So what are some of the ways that you have seen people go about mitigating the risk of fire? That's that traditional approach to it. And then what did you do at PG&E? What are some of the tips and tricks that you took away from PG&E?
Yeah, absolutely. So most wildfire mitigation activities are things like infrastructure, system hardening, vegetation management, fuels management, inspection, patrols on higher fire risk areas, hopefully a lot of customer outreach and help from the community. A lot of times I say, if we could all get the right tree in the right place at the right time, we could really solve a lot of problems. And it's not just with utilities, but if you drive around and just actually take a look at trees in municipal areas and the destruction they have on sidewalks and roads and the selection of tree species in parking lots, the whole overall picture is customer engagement and community outreach in terms of don't plant a pine tree directly underneath the transmission line. It might be great today, and a whole row of them might give you great visual protection from your neighbor, but when you move and sell your house in 20 years, that trees are going to grow into lines, which could then potentially be an outage. So I think that's a big part of it. And then leveraging fire science, weather technology, AI, predictive data. I think looking at if a fire does spread, where is it going to spread to? What assets are potentially affected by that? And then running a lot of what if scenarios. So I think it's a really big combination, and PG&E does all of that and more. They have their own fire science team. They have their own weather technology team. They really work hard on that. And I think that's a great lesson to take for the rest of the utility industry, is that the problems that California is facing today are the future problems of the West Coast, are the future problems of Oregon and Montana as climate change occurs, Texas, maybe for more like bushfires. And then you get into Australia with their bushfire issues. So it really is a worldwide issue. And so being able to understand, I think the most important thing is understanding with data and AI predictive technology where infrastructure hardening needs to be done and where it would have the best ROI, where undergrounding needs to be done, and whether it's even feasible or whether the undergrounding causes more environmental hazards than it potentially tries to stop. Vegetation management is cutting the right tree and not cutting the wrong tree. So with climate change, where we don't want to cut down a healthy green tree that's sequestering carbon and producing oxygen. And so understanding the tree health and understanding how that affects assets is all really important. And so that's really the approach that was taken at PG&E. And I think really the big piece overall, I think, is that getting all of that data into one area, into something that can be viewed by a field technician all the way through an executive, is what's really going to take vegetation management to the next level and really increase reliability and safety and reduce wildfires. I think so if you look at it, 90% of wildfires are caused by man-made activity, and somewhere around 50% of those fires on average are caused by vegetation related contact with utility lines. And that's a big chunk. That's 45% of all wildfires. And if we could really make an effort on that and improve that aspect and reduce that percentage, then we would see a really great benefit.
Yeah, it's really that holistic big picture view. And I think the problem with really any industry when you get talking about data is you get tons and tons of data, but it's hard to use. Yeah, I think getting it into one place that's actually actionable, that gives you recommendations and what does this next step look like? What is that critical area that I need to take action on? That's really that next unlock, I think, which is going to take this to a whole nother realm of conversation. I think you mentioned something too, which we started over it, but it's that idea of prevention versus situational awareness, right? Like you could do all the prevention in the world and you should be doing it. But the reality is that Mother Nature is undefeated. It's lightning is going to strike. Drought is unfortunately a thing. Climate change is getting worse. So having that situational awareness and having that data and knowledge to see, is this wildfire going into a natural fire break? Where's the wind shifting? How fast is this moving? What can I do to help mitigate the restoration even? I think that's a whole nother level of it, which is super important that doesn't get talked about enough.
Yeah, absolutely. I think what we're talking about now is probably the prevention side of it. And then there's the action and then post-action that also is absolutely important. We can talk all we want about not having a fire happen. What do we do when a fire does happen? Where is it going? Where do we stage crews? What does the potential spread impact look based on weather predictions? And so that all putting all that together and getting it in the hands of field crews and personnel and supervisors as they're making staging decisions and things like that are absolutely part of it. And then post-fire data gathering in terms of running satellite scans and things like that to give you a really overall high-level view of what happened, where it happened, and then being able to input that back into the utility system. And so that way you can identify work that based on a score or whatever, saying these are the most critical factors. If you install these lines in this order, it will be the most efficient and reduce overall outage time by 30 or 50 or whatever percent. And so as somebody who has lived through hurricanes in the Gulf Coast and went 17 days without power during Hurricane Ike, 30% of 17 days I would take anytime.
Yeah,
so
every second matters so much.
Absolutely. And it's not just hurricanes. There's winter storms. There are obviously wildfire. There, the ability to use data on this during and post storm or events in general, I think is really the future, and how to do the most with the budget, because the budgets are never going to be unlimited. And so being able to unequivocally say, yes, here's the plan, here's how we're going to do it, here's how we're mitigating risk, and then being able to rerun those scenarios as the work is being done, I think will keep boots on the ground. And I come from like the residential commercial side of arboriculture originally way back in the day. And so for me, it's the on the job time, right? So if we've got tree crews on the right trees at the right time, if we've got the certified arborists out there, which aren't getting any cheaper. So if we can get the certified arborists out there to look at the right trees and not just go and assess every tree along a 300-foot segment, and to go and say, hey, here are the top 10% or top 50%, whatever number that is, but here's the risk that we've decided we need to be looking at right now. Go look at these 10 trees instead of those 100 trees. And that way, when they look at 100 trees in a day, they're able to say, yes, these are the 100 riskiest trees in my area. And so you're still getting work done on a circuit basis. We're not changing the system or totally doing a paradigm shift, because things still have to be done in some kind of order. But within the utility system, I think efficiencies are definitely where we can make definitely a lot of change.
Yeah, I think that data, the biggest piece in my mind is just having that confidence to be able to go to your boss and say, hey, listen, I know I don't have the budget, but here's what I can do with this budget, and this is the impact I can make. And you have confidence bringing that to them because the data backs it up. And I think that's a huge thing in any job, especially in utilities when you're talking about life and death situations and wildfire mitigation. You need to have confidence in what you're doing.
Right, absolutely. And then a lot with that data, there's a lot of areas that might not need to be worked this cycle. And so that's where you can get a lot of those efficiencies. where if a utility is working on a 1,000-mile circuit, but only 750 miles actually need to be worked on, then you can see where the efficiencies are gathered.
So let's shift gears a little bit and let's move into kind of the regulatory pressures. Obviously, all utilities face it, but specifically around wildfires, what does that look like?
Sure. Yeah. And so a lot of my experience has been with the CPUC, California Public Utility Commission, and legal requirements like California General Order 95. And so California is probably the lawyer's paradise for wildfire regulations. But again, I think what California is experiencing now and in the last 20 years is probably what states like Oregon and Washington and Idaho and Colorado are experiencing maybe the beginning of now. And so the regulatory pressures on utilities, particularly for wildfires, I think are only going to increase. And so it's a good thing to understand what utilities face in California and then be able to take those learning lessons and move forward. These requirements are non-negotiable. The California Public Utility Commission is the top of the mountain. They decide what we're allowed to do. They decide rates. They decide basically everything for California residents in terms of utility. And so with the legislature passing requirements in terms of minimum clearance distances, in terms of requirements for inspections, in terms of requirements for wildfire mitigation plans, things like that, there are entire teams and divisions within PG&E and within SoCal Edison, within San Diego Gas and Electric, and all the other utilities that exist in California that really work 365 days a year to meet these regulatory standards. And so the process is extremely difficult, extremely lengthy. It's very stressful. I think anytime non-lawyers are involved in a legal process, there's just automatically that stress, right? So anytime as a program manager that I got that email from legal requesting documents, and it's definitely something that you never really want to get. And so you hope you never do. But I think staying compliant is more that proactive approach as well, right? In the past, you're sifting through files and paperwork to try to find completed work orders, and it takes weeks, and the discovery process is probably intensely arduous. And the future would be able to kind of have all this on a digital platform, so where you could come in and search based on whatever regulatory questions and then basically pull up the plan right then and there. So I think understanding the risk profile across the service territory is really important. It allows executives and managers to work on areas that can reduce risk as much as possible. And that's really the future, is risk profiling, understanding, particularly for wildfire risk. And we talked about spread and asset protection and things like that. Being able to plan and forecast wildfire risk and spread in order to know what assets to harden and where to remove vegetation risk is really the future, to be able to for a utility to go to a regulator and say, here's my plan. Here's what we based our plan off of. Here's the data that we have that we based our plan off of. And if things happen, here's plan B, C, D, and E kind of thing. And so having the data on risk and vegetation health and that whole portfolio in one platform to be able to put that together for a potential supplemental to a wildfire mitigation plan, or when the regulatory commission comes in and asks, like God forbid, a tree falls and causes an outage that was determined to be a low risk tree, that still could potentially happen. But if there is a plan that's put in place with clear and concise expectations and a well-determined risk portfolio and plan, then when those things do happen, the liability that a utility faces is going to be less. If there is an outage, or if something does happen and a utility can't say when the last time assets were inspected, or doesn't know the risk level of any given circuit and can't say unequivocally, like, here's what we did and here's why, then the regulators are going to start to ask more questions, and that's where liability comes in. So having a good plan, being able to share that data, the reasons why and all that with regulators, so that way they feel more comfortable with the process, I think is really the big tip in staying compliant. Is if you can get ahead of it, then, and so that way regulators know what you're doing and why, then if something does happen, they understand that there's a process to it and what was going on.
It goes back to what we said earlier, which was the data gives you the confidence to go to whoever that next level is. And if you can go to your regulators and say, this is the plan we put together, here's the data, here's what we did and what we achieved, when things do happen, because they always will happen, the regulators are going to say, okay, you're actually working on it. We've seen you make progress. We've seen the data, as opposed to saying, we thought we did this. So it's taking that data driven approach, I think, is going to help that regulatory relationship building even. It's huge.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think regulatory agencies, by giving them data and things like that, they're able to look at the information presented to make sure that it actually is correct and what's being done is being done. So yeah, absolutely a huge piece of it. And it's not just regulatory aspects, it's capital improvement projects and things like that too, where if you're able to show that this is technically a high fire threat area, the risk for wildfire is extremely high. A lot of vegetation work is being done, but system hardening needs to happen. And so being able to justify those capital expenses and be able to get that approved by the commission for potential rate increases or however that works. Don't really do the finance side. Definitely the data-driven approach is not just for wildfire mitigation. It's really an across-the-board process improvement.
So what would you say would be the biggest opportunities for companies today, utilities today, as their obviously wildfire risk is increasing? We talked about it. 1 in 8 acres is burning. Climate change is getting worse. Dry season is getting longer. What should utilities be thinking about and doing today to get ahead of this?
Yeah, absolutely. We just talked about process improvements. I think that is one that's really important. That on the job time is going to continue to be extremely important. Making sure that field inspections are occurring when necessary. So using technology, leveraging satellite inspections or other ground-based or aerial-based LiDAR, which can be very expensive, but being able to have data for areas to be able to put ground inspectors in the right place at the right time. So process improvements all across the board for vegetation management, for linemen and crews working on pole restoration and things like that. So process improvements are going to be really extremely important. And so that comes into like data needs. So with process improvements, we need data. We need to know everything we possibly can. What are the environmental conditions that every pole and asset are facing? Because pole in, Sacramento County or somewhere in this area, Northern California, is not the same as Santa Barbara County or somewhere like in Central Coast. And so there are different environmental conditions across the state. So knowing what those are, having that information, knowing what vegetation is there, vegetation risk, tree health. So data is extremely important. We talked about fire spread, wildfire risk. That comes into fuel loading and weather and drought conditions and soil moisture content. And so there's just layers and layers of data. And having a platform to be able to know what to do with all that data and what all that data means goes back into that process improvements. Team structure is going to be really important. I think there are a lot of layers at utilities, and coming from the field, I think having that kind of field perspective is really important. And so getting field managers and things like that, the tools to do the job and to be able to have that same dashboard as an executive or a supervisor that maybe doesn't spend as much time in the field, I think will really help that continuity across the team. And then within all that, grid hardening, right? So getting vegetation cleared, removing unhealthy vegetation, mitigating risk that way. There are pole applications that reduce the risk of the pole burning. There are new switches and all the technology for distribution and transmission equipment is just incredibly interesting. If you ever have a chance, just go YouTube some stuff and you can probably nerd out for 30 minutes or an hour on just incredible technology. But again, you get back to the budget. So you can't replace every single mile of distribution line and transmission line within any utility with the newest, best and greatest technology, because the ratepayers they won't have it. So you have to balance all that. So I think that's the data and process improvements will really go into efficiently doing grid hardening and efficiently doing vegetation management to really mitigate the risk as much as possible.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a nice segue to this, and it's that kind of relationship between the contractor and the utility and how this is going to play together for the future. It's that like kind of principal agent conflict that I think is talked about in some different industries, but I think especially so in utilities with the contractor business model that pretty much all utilities use. So can I dive into that a little bit?
Yeah, so I think a lot of times there's a partnership between the utilities and contractors that is really built on trust and years of working together and things like that. And so anytime that a utility is looking for efficiency, I think it might worry a contractor in terms of efficiency probably means less budget and less money. And there's always that conflict between a utility trying to save as much money and a contractor trying to make as much of a profit as possible. And so balancing those two conflicts, I think, is really important. And so getting the buy-in for contractors for this kind of shift that needs to be done to a more technology-based, risk-based, data-based approach, and really getting them to understand that doesn't mean that we're cutting their jobs. That doesn't mean that we are paying people less. What it means is that we recognize the importance of the work. And so we're going to put the contractors in the right place to do the work. And part of that is being more efficient with routing, with place to do the work. And part of that is being more efficient with routing, with assignments and things like that, and understanding what type of equipment needs to be used. Understanding if you can get bucket work in there, then obviously you can be more efficient with bucket work. And so there's a lot of data-driven approaches that will benefit contractors as well. And so if they can be more efficient, they can cut more trees per person per day, they can do it safer. And oh, by the way, you guys are doing more, you're producing more and reducing risk more with the same dollars or with less dollars. And so getting that buy-in and showing how efficiency can be achieved across the board. So that way that partnership can continue. I think it's going to be really important. And a lot of technology might not be able to be adopted by every contractor that exists that serves utilities across the country. And so a lot of it does fall on the utilities to really provide that technology and that resource and hold their contractors accountable. And then also ensuring that they are able to earn money on their investments. They have to be able to at least make a little bit of a profit, or are they going to be in business? And then what happens if you lose a contractor that does 15, 20% of the work across the service territory? What does that mean? And so there are a lot of thoughts in that, but I think ensuring that it's a good partnership and that buy-in is across the board and everybody sees the benefit is going to be really important.
Yeah, exactly. It's a tricky situation because you're right. There's this need between, we need to get the work done. This is a business. We need to still turn a profit. At the same time, how can we work together to be the most efficient? And I can always go back in that efficiency conversation to, and you send a crew out to go replace a wire being down or whatever the case may be. And then they do that, they go away. That's great. But then they find out the next day that half a mile away from there, something else happened. They had to get called back out. It's what if they could be doing that work in the same day as opposed to needing to do all this back and forth? The work's getting done, you're getting paid for the work, but it's really reducing those miles driven. It's reducing all the different truck rolls. It's just a whole cascading effect of things.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And I think the data-driven approach will help alleviate some of those issues. Absolutely.
So let's move into kind of technology. You've talked about data, you've talked about LiDAR, we've briefly kind of talked about satellites. What are some of those most common technologies used to mitigate wildfire risk in your experience?
Yeah, most common is going to be manual inspections. So humans driving in their trucks, doing tree assessments, doing pole replacements, climbing poles, and doing asset inspections. There's also ground-based LiDAR. There's aerial LiDAR, so fixed wing and helicopter. There's weather and fire spread forecasting technologies. Satellite technology is something that's new and really, I think, going to really change the game, because in a perfect world, if we could just have almost a CIA level view of our assets on a regular basis and have a good change detection model built in, then we can probably forecast out, hey, this piece of equipment or this tree, we forecast being a risk in 18 months. And yeah, there's a lot of technology out there. You can find tons of different companies offering different things. And it's a great time to be in the veg management industry. I think the next couple decades are going to be extremely interesting in terms of industry that hasn't really changed that much over the last 100 years.
Yeah, exactly. And I think there's a lot of synergies with these technologies. It's not a LiDAR or manual inspection. It's not satellites or LiDAR. They have different use cases and they play in different situations. So it's really finding what that best mix is, I think, is super important for all utilities, no matter what their situation is. So speaking of satellites, how do you think satellite technology stacks up to some of these, I think, more traditional things? Like you mentioned, manual inspections, ground-based LiDAR, aerial LiDAR, they have all of these things, but what's the pros and cons of each? And how does satellite as the new kid on the block stack up?
Yeah, absolutely. Manual inspections, obviously, you've got the human fallibility error potential in there. You've got for every 100,000 miles driven, there's 2.5 car accidents on average. There's so many costs involved with manual inspections, right? Ground-based LiDAR is expensive. You've got a car with cameras attached to it, basically driving around. Aerial LiDAR, anything with an airplane, fixed wing, or helicopter is incredibly expensive, right? So all of these technologies are expensive. And so I think that's really the one big difference for satellite is that the costs involved and the data gathered is just incredibly valuable. And satellites can give basically a service territory view all the way down to a single asset or a single line span view. And so you get a lot of data, and it really can serve as like the first step in mitigating wildfire risk, in determining efficiencies and needs and things like that. Like we've been talking about in terms of a layered approach, where a satellite scan can give a program manager information on where to send crews on any given day. So if let's go back to working at PG&E and as a program manager, opening a circuit for inspection. What that means is you basically have one of the clerks open it and assign it to the crew. The field inspectors go out and drive and walk every mile of the circuit, whether it's 100 miles or 1,000 miles. And so built in there, there are some areas that don't have any trees. There's some areas that are clear and maintained maybe last year. And so there's a lot of inefficiencies built into that. So if I had the ability to have a satellite scan run prior to opening a circuit, I would be able to basically not assign areas that I knew were in compliance and did not possess risk based on grow-ins and future growth, tree health, and the whole gambit of data. And then I could have the crews more efficiently go out and do their inspections. And you're decreasing the amount of time it takes to get these circuits worked. So that way the crew can go work and get another circuit inspected. And so it's the same thing with tree work. It basically gives me a high level view of a circuit, of a span, of basically the entire service territory. And so with those tools, you could then say, okay, do I need a LiDAR inspection in this area or do I not? Do I need a fixed wing or helicopter LiDAR scan, or do I need to send tree crews out there? And so if you can say no, every mile that's not worked saves money and allows the crews to actually work on areas that do need it. I think with current technology, being able to do tree health assessments and grow in potential and vegetation clearance distances, satellite technology is really a game changer. And in the future, being able to have 10 centimeter resolution where you've got 2 or 3 inches, where you can see whether a pole or a recloser or a switch or something has been damaged, I think you're really able to get more done with less. And so that's really what we're all working to do, right? That's why Henry Ford created the assembly line. That's why Tesla works the way it does. That's why SpaceX works the way it does. So being able to be more efficient and do more with less is the future, and satellites are really the key to that.
That's the name of the game. And I know I hear all the time about satellite data and it gives you a ton, but can you do anything with it? So as a former vegetation program manager, is that data actionable in your eyes? What does it help you do?
Yeah, so it can be actionable and it can be just a data mess. It depends on the format. So I think having an actionable dashboard, what that does is gives potential program managers, field managers, executives, supervisors the ability to look at their assignment area and basically ensure that the risk is being mitigated as quickly as possible, that the plan that they're currently executing, because so much of it is executing a plan and then not knowing how that plan is working until you finish with the plan and then have a fire season to go through. But with satellite technology, you're able to potentially run more scans and do more. I'm thinking in the future of a daily or a weekly scan. So you would be able to know my risk score this week versus last week. How many trees are in my risk category that I'm mitigating? And so I think having all of that data allows people to understand things better. And so without having to send anybody out, I can get up at 6 o'clock in the morning before anybody's up and out in the field and know what we're doing is working or not working and whether we need to adjust. And so I think having that kind of data in a platform that can be easily processed makes it actionable. You can really do anything you want to. Thinking of a red flag warning day and sending a team of field inspectors out to a high fire threat district. And in the past, you just tell them to go to Circuit X and they drive around Circuit X until their day is over. And in the future, it's, hey, go to Circuit X and here are your 10 hotspots. I want you to go look at and make sure that these have been deemed the most risky with the vegetation that's at most risk, or there might be a school or a hospital or something that's downstream that we really cannot have go out. And so having that allows people to put the right people in the right place at the right time and spend that dollar today to do the best that they can.
It's so many business decisions that can be made. It's just the key is there's obviously tons of data. We're talking like this is growing at this span and these weather variables and soil conditions and all this stuff. And I think the key is it has to be in a platform and a dashboard that's easy to use, that has that kind of AI that you don't have to have a data science team to do all the heavy lifting, that these recommendations just serve to you to make these decisions. Otherwise, what's the point? You're just adding more complexity to your day.
You can drown in data. So you've got to be able to have an actionable platform with reports that can be run, reports that can be sent, continuity from field all the way to executive. And yeah, that's a big future problem. And so making sure that we have actionable data, not just data, is going to be extremely important.
So I think we have about 2 minutes left. Can you just give me the top benefits in your mind as a former vegetation manager of satellite technology for wildfire risk mitigation and I guess restoration too, if you want to hit both of those?
Yeah, absolutely. To me, it's worker safety, it's reliability, it's cost savings, those big four things. So for me, it's worker safety is always the most important, right? We've got to take care of the workers that are actually out there doing this work. Vegetation management is some of the most dangerous work. It's right up there with like offshore crabbing. So it's very dangerous. The linemen are working around technology that if they make one wrong move will kill them. And so safety is extremely important. Reliability, making sure that customers have power when they need it. And the changes in reliability concerns as people move from home to work from home and things like that. So that's increasing reliability, even 10% is going to be a huge benefit. And then cost savings as well. Inflation's going crazy. Arborists are more expensive than they have ever been. Fuel is more expensive than it's ever been. So the cost of doing business is not going down. And if it's costing 10% more this year to do work and the budget's the same, what gives? Right. So if budget doesn't give and worker safety doesn't give, then you end up reliability giving, or trees get pushed off to next year and projects get moved. So I think those four things are really the big benefits. And then having better reliability and safe workers and cost savings takes care of liability, because that's its own separate conversation. But liability is taken care of by working on those big three.
Yeah, no, I think those are the big things that every utility struggles with. And I think just that push and pull, right? If budget's not going to give, then we have to sacrifice worker safety or reliability. And we don't want to give either there. So it's just a weird balance that every utility has to strike. Very good points there. I think we're out of time. So Robert, I really appreciate you taking this hour and talking me through wildfire mitigation, satellite technology, kind of going from this old way to new way with a data-driven approach. I think it's been a really great conversation for me. I've learned a lot, and I think everybody listening will too.
Absolutely. Yeah, I appreciate it for setting this up, and we'll definitely have to do it again.